Inside of Westminster Abbey, for over 400 years, a Queen of England was left unburied. Royal burials were usually huge, spectacular events. For example, the funeral of Elizabeth I, which brought an end to the Tudor period, was huge and incredible. Henry VIII's funeral, for example, even had to see roads being widened for it to pass by, and he would then be buried inside of St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. Henry VIII wanted to be interred in a huge tomb, but this would never happen, as the tomb was never finished by his children following his death. But Henry VIII's great-grandmother would be subjected to a harrowing afterlife in which her corpse and remains were treated terribly after her death. Katherine of Valois is remembered today for being the Queen of England, who was left unburied for 400 years inside of Westminster Abbey. But what is the story of her harrowing treatment? Katherine of Valois was the queen and wife of Henry V of England, the warrior king who was said to have been one of the greatest to ever rule over the nation. Henry won spectacular victories against the French at the Battle of Agincourt during the 100 Years' War, but negotiations occurred to marry the English king to Katherine, who was a French princess, and the plan was to combine the two thrones of England and France, with the future children and heirs being the king of both nations. But when Katherine was pregnant with her second child, her husband, Henry V, became very ill, and he was sick. At this time, Katherine was just 21 in a foreign country, and she was now a dowager queen and was the mother of King of England and France, Henry VI. Katherine was now a wanted woman, and she was seen as a possible wife for many nobles because they wanted to be the power behind the King of England, the child of Katherine. But she did have a relationship with Owen Tudor, the keeper of her wardrobe, and they later got married and they had many children. It was this that gave the Tudor family the links to the throne that they would later exploit. However, on the 3rd of February 1437, after giving birth, Katherine of Valois died. She passed away from complications from childbirth, and she'd been ill for a while and had even gone to Bermondsey Abbey for prayer and possible treatment. But Katherine was given a huge funeral, despite the scandal with her marriage, and she was embalmed and her internal organs were removed after death to prevent decay, and then her chest cavity was stuffed with spices and herbs. Katherine's body was then wrapped in a thick and heavy material cerecloth, which was dipped in wax, and her body was then encased in lead before it was placed into a wooden coffin. The organs of Katherine were removed and they were then placed inside of different jars and boxes, and they were buried in different locations to the rest of her body. During the funeral procession, an effigy showing Katherine of Valois was placed on top of the coffin, and it showed the Dowager Queen dressed in her fine clothes, and this was painted to look as realistic as possible, and it shows Katherine as a tall woman with blue-grey eyes. The wooden effigy was, for many, the first time they'd seen any image of the Queen and former wife of Henry V. But Katherine was then given a second funeral service on the 8th of February 1437, 5 days after her death, and she was laid to rest in an alabaster tomb in Westminster Abbey, close to the tomb of her husband, Henry V. Now this could have been the end of Katherine of Valois' story and account in the history books. However, she would then, for the next few centuries, be subjected to a horrific ordeal. The tomb she was placed in was temporary, as Henry VI, her son, wanted to make a huge memorial for her, but he died before this could occur, and Henry VI had also been deposed during the Wars of the Roses. But Henry VII, Katherine's grandson, would then demolish the old Lady Chapel where she was buried, and he planned to build a new one which would become a big Tudor mausoleum. However, during the work, the tomb of Katherine was destroyed, and Katherine of Valois' body was unearthed as new foundations of the chapel were dug up. Katherine's wooden coffin, which had been interred below ground for around 50 to 60 years, had been decaying, and the wood had rotted a lot. Her remains were then taken out of the coffin, with the coffin being opened, and they were even taken from the lead-lined inner coffin. Her remains were then placed into a wooden chest, which was then covered over roughly with lead from the old roof of the chapel, This new coffin or box containing the former queen's remains was then laid near to the feet of her husband's tomb, and it would be left there unburied for around 300 to 400 years. Henry VII may have ordered this to distance himself from his relatives and Catherine's scandalous marriage to Owen Tudor. He said that, "In our monastery at Westminster rests our noble progenitors and blood, and specially the body of our great dame of right noble memory, Queen Katherine, wife to King Henry V. Our body therefore to be buried within the same monastery, that is to say, in the chapel where our said great dame lay buried." It seems he envisioned the Lady Chapel as a family tomb for all the Tudors. But Henry VII died before the Lady Chapel could be finished, and his successor, the infamous six-wived king Henry VIII, did not bury his great-grandmother Katherine of Valois. Neither did any of the other Tudors. The chest she was put inside of had a lid in 2 parts, and people would be shown her remains if they paid a small fee, and tourists came into Westminster Abbey and even pulled back the cerecloth showing her face. It was said that, the bones being firmly united and thinly clothed with flesh, like scrapings of tanned leather, and visitors to the abbey said she had bare skin and was buried naked with no clothes, except for her cerecloth shroud. Some tour guides even made money from this, and Katherine of Valois was becoming a morbid tourist attraction. Lots of people who witnessed her body would go further, though, and they would flock to Westminster Abbey to even touch and at times kiss her body. The famous London writer and diarist Samuel Pepys even kissed her corpse, and he wrote on this: "On Shrove Tuesday, 1669, I to the Abbey went, and by favour did see the body of Queen Katherine of Valois, and had the upper part of the body in my hands, and I did kiss her mouth, reflecting upon it, I did kiss a queen. And this my birthday, I 36 years old, and I did kiss a queen." So people would flock to the abbey to kiss the corpse of the queen, and this became a tradition. But there was much more further horrific actions taken against her life, and it was said in the 18th century that her body had been ripped to pieces by a group of young scholars. It was said the queen's body was a shapeless mass of whitish colour, and it had much stolen from it. People had taken her teeth, and some of her bones would later be taken. However, in 1788, the remains were placed inside of a vault for around 100 years. But then during the reign of Queen Victoria, her vault was opened and people broke in to see if her body was really there in the Villiers vault. But they found the remains of her on top of a pile of coffins, and the wooden coffin of Katherine of Valois had been placed inside of, yet again rotted, and it was in a bad way. It had stuck to another coffin, and the people managed to free it, but when it came out into the air, the wood perished. However, when Catherine's body was looked at again, there was a lot missing. Some said it had been covered in lime, and several parts of it had decayed, and the front part of her skull had gone missing, and one part of the back of this was found lying on her pelvis. A lot of her backbones had been stolen, as were all her ribs but one, along with 2 of her arm bones. Souvenir hunters had taken a lot of her remains, and her legs were found in perfect condition, still wrapped in the 12 layers of cerecloth which preserved them hundreds of years later. The coffin was replaced, and her remains were then placed into it. A witness who saw it being carried into Henry V's chapel said, "It was a striking and impressive scene, which I shall ever remember, and which at the time it was impossible to view without some feeling of emotion. The daylight had quite faded, and we were alone in the darkened abbey. 2 workmen took up the box containing the Queen's remains, and followed Mr. Poole and the clerk of the works, the latter carrying in his hands one small lantern to light us, led us way out of St. Nicholas's Chapel to the north side of the Chantry Chapel. Mr. George Scarfe and myself followed. No one else was present, and we seemed unconsciously and silently to fall into a sort of processional order. I remarked to him, 'We are attending the Queen's 3rd funeral.' Not a word was said as we passed slowly round the ambulatory in the darkness. Her remains inside of a thick English oak coffin were marked by an inscription showing the bizarre journey her remains had been on. They built a new tomb near to the altar, and in Henry V's chapel her remains were laid to rest 400 years finally after the death of Katherine of Valois. The inscription marked, "It is the latest royal tomb in the abbey, and though long delayed, it has been thought that the singular and romantic history of a French princess and an English queen should at length be brought to an honourable end. Requiescate in pace." Katherine of Valois' body and remains were subjected to a horrific treatment in the years after her death, and people even kissed her decaying remains hundreds of years after she succumbed to death. It was a horrific thing, and people inside of Westminster Abbey even tried to make money from the unburied queen. Yet she never deserved this, and she was a queen who was not given any respect following her death. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.